Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Friday. Thank you for joining us today for this training.
Is it okay to?
This training is presented by the Ohio Chapter American Academy of Pediatrics, and we want to thank the Ohio Department of Health for their support. This training is on the Introduction to Trauma-Informed Care in Pediatrics and ACEs. Our program today is on the Preventative Health Program. Our next training will be on May 6th with our spring meeting on adolescent behavioral health, and we would love for you all to register and join if you're able to. I will now let our speakers, Dr. James Duffy and Dr. Andrew Gardner, introduce themselves, and then we will get started.
Thank you, Alex, for this opportunity, and hello to everybody. Thanks for joining us today with this conversation. I think probably what's easiest if I introduce myself now, and Andy will introduce himself when he starts talking. So let's do it that way. My name is Jim Duffy. I have a clinical appointment in pediatrics and child psychiatry at Wright State at Boone Schwab School of Medicine. I'm also the chair of the Executive Committee of the Council on Community Pediatrics and for the American Academy of Pediatrics. And I also I see on the list some people from the Ohio Department of Health, and I thank you for joining us. I'm a medical consultant for the Bureau for Maternal, Child, and Family Health at ODH. And today we're going to talk about trauma-informed care. I think sort of briefly, I'm going to do an introduction, and we'll follow that up really with implementation and talking about promotion of relational health within pediatric care systems in general. And Andy's going to do that, and I think that I'll talk a little bit about toxic stress initially to sort of bring us to the same page, and about the implementation of trauma-informed care. And I'll extend a little bit into the implementation, but I think we'll concentrate on promotion. This is a prevention series, and so we're not going to talk necessarily about treatment, but we're going to talk mostly about mitigation strategies and early intervention and prevention. Next slide, please. I have no personal financial relations, but I think my wife would like me to have some, but I don't. So next slide, please. These are the learning objectives, at least for the first part of this, for those who are applying for credit in some way. we're going to discuss trauma-informed care as a secondary prevention and define these are sort of new ideas that define pediatric medical traumatic stress. These are responses to actually being within the health system. And we'll talk about identifying children and families at risk, and then implement basic strategies. Next slide, please. For reference primarily, last August, there were three statements, official statements from the Academy that were presented together. The trauma-informed care and child health systems was the policy. Trauma-informed care, the second is a clinical guidance document. Heather Forkey and Moira Salagi were primarily authors of that. And then Andy Gardner is the primary author of the Preventing Childhood Toxic Stress. And that's really what the meat of this presentation today will be. And that'll start up in about a half an hour. Next slide. As a sort of a summary slide initially, trauma-informed care is an organizing principle. Most of us do this, most of this naturally. And I don't want to say that we're laying on a lot of new responsibilities to folks. We have enough responsibility as it is, but this is an organizing principle, and it's something to keep in mind. It's based on the science of toxic stress and attachment theory. And we'll talk something about that, but the acronym there is SSNR, which is a safe, stable, and nurturing relationships. It comes from the CDC related to child abuse prevention. Trauma-informed care is an asset-driven rather than deficit-based, and it promotes relational health and family resilience. And I will go through all this. Next slide, please. And just another sort of summary slide. There are 3 or 4 R's to remember. Trauma-informed care is based on a realization that early childhood experiences, in particular early childhood adversity, have lifelong effects. And the early childhood adversity in particular creates stress, which is at least potentially stressful experiences. And there are a number of risk factors, of course, but there's also, we recognize that trauma-related signs and symptoms by screening and surveillance, and then we respond. And there are 2 ways that we respond within a child health system. And one is to resist re-traumatization, and there are policies and procedures that we can implement. And we also buffer secondary traumatic stress. I'll talk about that. But what you can see here, and I think Andy will repeat, is a public health stratification that from your right to left, toxic stress is those children who require treatment. We're not talking about those today. On the far left is an adaptive sort of stress, and that's something we take care of actually in primary prevention and primary care, and we promote relational health in primary care as the strategy. Tolerable stress, though, and I'll mention that in a minute, that's secondary prevention, and that's where TIC fits with the 3 or 4 R's. The realize lifelong effects, recognize the signs and symptoms, and respond with practice management policies and procedures. Next slide, please. And next slide. Why do people in particular have stress? Well, stress in general disrupts homeostasis, and the stress response then returns the body to homeostasis after the stress is over. And why zebras don't get ulcers is because they are very good at returning to homeostasis or returning to baseline. You can imagine a zebra at a watering hole, and a lion is creeping up, and the zebra takes off at a full run with a full stress response, and it's a binary outcome, isn't it? They either become lunch or they go back to lunch. They go back to eating grass. Unfortunately, humans are able to trigger the stress response with thoughts and memories and feelings, and it may become a regular, recurrent problem, and that regular, recurrent problem and the chronic elevation of the stress response then is what we call toxic stress. Tolerable stress is when we can mitigate the toxic stress, and it's buffered primarily by SSNRs. And positive stress can help kids grow. You know, we are challenging our children every day, and they learn to tolerate the stress, and they learn to move along in the developmental pathways to grow and thrive and flourish. Next slide. We talked originally about the ACEs, and we use that term. It's adverse childhood events. But the original study in ACEs was really about intrafamilial problems, child abuse, child neglect, and household dysfunction. What we know is that most kids have exposure to childhood adversity, and not necessarily intrafamilial. It may be intrafamilial, but it's also community-based. Or it may be a mass trauma event. It may be a natural disaster like a hurricane or a earthquake. It may be what we're experiencing right now in terms of war and migration, for instance, at the southern border. We have some cross-cutting factors, and racism is the big one. I want to mention those populations at risk. I want to make sure that we understand that these are at-risk populations, and they're not necessarily being identified as unique. But I'll mention for sure that the most common reported adverse childhood experience is economic hardship or poverty. Second probably is the loss of a parent and family separation. Next slide, please. And this is the CDC pyramid. I won't spend time on this, but you just basically see from the bottom that adverse childhood events then turn into functional impairments or maladaptive behavior and diseases, chronic diseases, and early death. I've highlighted on the left the interference with relational health because it's less dramatic, but it probably is most pervasive and the longest affecting the outcome of families and children. Next. And this is an example of the intrafamilial effects. These are what we see is there's a dose response increased risk. So if you screen for ACEs, which I'm not particularly recommending you do, but if you do, what you see is from a number from 1 to 10, and each time you have a positive on the ACE screen on the 10 factor questions, the 10 question questionnaire. You increase the risk of all these things. And you see on the left-hand side are more biological problems, and on the right-hand side, more relational problems, some biological. Next slide. This was, I think if you want one reference, this is an excellent reference, came out in November of 2019. It's a Morbidity and Mortality Weekly. The survey was broad. It was a meta survey the CDC did. It looked over a number of databases, and what they found by using logistic regression modeling was that they could convincingly argue that reduction in early childhood adversity and exposure to early childhood adversity would reduce those diseases, those adult conditions, the COPD, heavy drinking, but most importantly, the most important chronic illness in the world, depression. And if we reduced early childhood adversity or mitigated the effects of potentially traumatic events, then we could reduce depression by over 40%. And as a matter of fact, their recommendations was to support SSNRs, create healthy communities, and apply primary and secondary prevention strategies based on TIC. So really very consistent with what we would recommend as well. Next slide. I'm not going to go through this a whole lot, but I want to just shout out to John Bowlby. John Bowlby was a child psychiatrist that developed attachment theory, and what we see, though, is particularly in foster care situations, is that that children who are exposed to early childhood adversity, particularly situations that create a problem with basic trust, the establishment of basic trust, then for the rest of their lives in general, until they have appropriate interventions, they are at risk of having relationship-based problems that mostly interfere with their ability to create secure relationships with other people. Next slide. So that's one sort of one pathway to evaluate this, but for the academicians or the school-related people who are on the call today, another way to measure the effect of early childhood adversity is to look at school outcomes. And in my mind, this is a very clear message that this is the pathway to school to prison pipeline. If you screen kids early on in 3rd grade or 5th grade for ACEs, that those children who are high on the adverse childhood events screening tool are 3 times more likely to fail and 5 times more likely to have attendance problems. You can read this: 6 times more likely to have severe problems and 4 times more likely to have self-report poor health. So what I think the clinical presentation is: the 1st grader with unruly behavior, at risk for multiple suspensions, poor reading ability, decreased graduation, criminalization of youth behavior, and early incarceration. School to prison pipeline. Next slide. I've mixed up the words here a little bit, because toxic stress. Now, this is my view, and I think there are other views, but I would argue that when we say toxic stress, we're really talking about the physiologic response, the biomedical response. Toxic stress is prolonged activation of the bodily stress response in the absence of buffering. It's mostly cortisol, but there are other hormone factors, and this is the pipeline, or this is the mechanism through chronically elevated stress hormones, then interacting with inflammatory factors that creates long-term illness in adults. Trauma, on the other hand, includes sort of the interpersonal, the relational, and the spiritual well-being in terms of the outcome. So toxic stress then sort of is, in my mind, the physiologic, and trauma is the experience. Now, the experience can be obviously emotionally harmful, but that also has there are individual sort of temperament differences in the experience of those potentially traumatic events. And we'd like to strengthen the resilience so that children are not children who are exposed to potentially traumatic events don't have those long-term outcomes. Next slide. And this is just a slide that talks about traumatic stress reactions. These are things that we see, particularly in children who have been exposed over the long term. They have re-experiencing, similar to soldiers coming back from war zones. They want to avoid talking about these things, but they also withdraw. So they may, you may see kids in foster care, for instance, display less interest in the usual activities or feeling emotionally numb. That's a very difficult one. When kids feel emotionally numb, in my experience in caring for early teenagers, that they're much more likely to be cutters and slashers, and those kids that are that the only way they really feel things is by using a razor blade on the inside of their legs, or something as dramatic as that. Hyperarousal can also, so there's sort of an internalizing pathway, and there's also an externalizing pathway. So kids are irritable and they lose sleep. This could be short-term or it can be long-term. Next slide. Here's the key. This is the thing that you have to remember for the next part of the presentation, and as a takeaway: relational health buffers trauma. So if you remember in your mind that first slide, looking at toxic stress, tolerable stress, and adaptive stress, relational health moves the stress response along that continuum from toxic through tolerable to adaptive. And the most important and frequent commonality of children who succeed have at least one stable and committed relationship with a caregiver. Next slide. And I'm repeating myself here a little bit, but I'll just say that I want to make sure that people realize that there's some sort of intrinsic temperaments, intrinsic resilience factors. Sometimes the strong executive function and self-regulation are things that, we have less control over. We're born a certain way, but there are other things that that occur. The supportive relationship and solid grounding in cultural traditions are very strong foundations of resilience. Next slide. We propose a pediatric specific nosology. Some of these things are not within the DSM. The acute and chronic are probably within the DSM in terms of post-traumatic stress disorder, the acute and the chronic, but the complex I'm sorry for the graphic here. This complex and trauma means long-term trauma over a long period of time, and that's not well described. The long-term personality changes that occur that we recognize in children, particularly in foster care, children have been in abusive circumstances over a long period of time. We don't see that within the DSM. It's a problem. And one of the solutions is something that's called the developmental trauma disorder. And that it's been proposed. It was not accepted in the fifth DSM-5, but I suspect it will be at some time. Systemic trauma and intergenerational trauma is a cross-cutting factor. Racism and Native American and African American and now Asian American families, particularly within the last few years, we've seen this very, very dramatically. Pediatric medical traumatic stress, I'm going to spend a little time on. Next slide. There's some symptoms of developmental trauma disorder. I already talked about this some, and it's consistent with the trauma response, but over a long period of time, with attentional dysregulation, physiologic dysregulation, and difficulty with self-esteem and social connectedness. Next slide. Now, here's the question: can hospitalization? What I would say generally, this is about hospitals and for the pediatricians or the social workers that work in hospitals, you'll see this. But I would say in general, what we're talking about is community exposure or exposure within our child health service systems, the foster care systems, the social work systems, the therapy systems, in addition to outpatient clinics and other places where we might interact with children in primary care or in the hospital. Childhood injuries and illnesses are common, as you can read. Firearm injuries are very common. We've had a rash of that in Columbus and actually in Springfield, Ohio, and we're dealing with that on the state level in terms of legislation, of course. cancers and organ transplants are common. These are all potentially traumatic events. Next slide. This, I've already talked about this. So next slide, please. So pediatric medical traumatic stress is very unrecognized and untreated. In particular, if you look at if you interview parents who had children in the ICU, in the pediatric ICU, 3 to 6 months later, 20% of them will develop diagnosable PTSD. Do they get treatment? No. It's unrecognized and untreated, but it certainly has a long-term effect on families. And what we're talking about here is that the trauma-informed care is not just about the children. Although we focus on the children, of course, the children come first, but we also are talking about the families, and we're also talking about the nurses and the doctors and the social workers and other people who care for the families and the children. Up to 80% of children and family members experience post-traumatic stress symptoms following a life-threatening illness. And as you can read, 20 to 30% of parents and almost 25% of children and siblings have persistent post-traumatic stress symptoms that impair daily functioning. These are all related to ICU admissions. Next slide, please. There are more data on this slide. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but as you can see, it's very confirmatory. These are studies that come from different places in the world, some from Australia, some from Europe, some from the United States, and it's consistent. At least 10% of children and somewhere around 20 to 30% of parents have full PTSD, and it's persistent months to years after an exposure of a potentially traumatic event within the health system. Next slide. And you can just sort of scan over this with your own on your own and just see that there are many unique features of pediatric medical traumatic stress. One of the most important, I think, is the separation from parents and changes in family structure over the long-term period. Next slide. Secondary traumatic stress is something that we don't talk enough about, and this is the traumatic stress, the trauma to caretakers, to parents, to grandparents, other family members, but also first responders, EMTs, nurses in the ED, social workers that are going out to examine or to participate with child protection activities. Folks that are therapists that are hearing day to day on the stories of kids who have received trauma, they take it home. One of the things that really is, I think, is important, we have to keep in mind is that pediatric hospitals are often in inner cities and the people that work in the hospitals, the security guards, the housekeepers, even the dietary folks, even the receptionists are exposed to the stories and the visions, and they may be firsthand experiences of trauma, and they take it home. It's underdiagnosed, underrecognized. Next paragraph. Next slide, please. These are some just from the National Child Trauma Network. These are some quotes of people. I heard this when I retired from clinical practice a couple of years ago as a medical director of the complex care program at Date, and I heard all this. This is something that's really important. I still have a hard time driving by the hospital. And if you think about people who don't make it to appointments, who seem to be, in the bad word, non-compliant, but have difficulty engaging, well, they're doing that second strategy to dealing with trauma, which is avoidance of talking about it, avoidance of going back to the place. If you don't know that, if you don't think about re-traumatization and reducing the potential, then you're missing really some important factors of engagement within families and children with the treatment plan. Next slide. Burnout is related. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but those few studies about burnout would say that burnout and secondary traumatic stress are interrelated. They make each other more likely, and they're both related to substance abuse and even suicidal depression and suicidal behavior among healthcare workers and social workers, for instance, and child care workers. Child protection workers in particular. Next slide. So how do we recognize the signs and symptoms? And I'll be quick about this because I think that Andy will talk about this as well. Next slide. We move from, in terms of surveillance, which is sort of asking questions to face, we've moved from an idea of what's wrong with you to what's happened to you. And I think Andy taught me this one is the best surveillance question is, has anything sad, bad, or scary happened to you or your family since last time we talked? It just opens the door. It opens the door to listening and connecting with families and children. There are general principles about screening. If you use an instrument, you screen, the screening should also always benefit the patient. And that's the problem I have with screening for adverse childhood events within general populations, because a lot of times and I've had this experience of working in the community, this screening is not really a screening like, is there lead in your home? This is a disclosure, and the disclosure can be traumatic itself, and you have to have services available to care for people who are disclosing trauma. And I can tell you stories about it. I think you can tell me stories about people who expose themselves or disclose trauma after, and there's nobody there really to take care of it. So I think that you have to think about whether or not you actually want to apply universal screening. Next slide. Then I think very importantly, you move on to even the next step. What's strong with you? This came from a person who was talking about resilience promotion on indigenous lands in the Navajo Nation. So there are ways that you can provide protective factor survey and do a strength-based assessment. In the hospital, I think it's really important. What's your previous experience in the hospital? Have you been here? Has the child been here? How did the child respond? What particular factors did trigger the child? What are the resilience factors? What are the protective factors in the family, as you see along the right-hand side? So you move from what's wrong with you to what's happened to you, and then finally what's strong with you, and that's the prevention strategy. Next slide, please. So here's some clinical presentations. I won't belabor this. I think that Andy will do this as well, but you can see that many of the clinical presentations are consistent with the post-traumatic stress responses that I listed before. Inability to discuss their emotional feelings. That's really important. That's that feeling in daisy, in a daze or spacey. Those are I want to highlight that because those are very serious problems. Those are reasons to refer. Those are reasons to refer for care, because those are the ones that anticipate depersonalization or dissociative disorders. Next slide, please. And you can take a look here, the re-traumatization of healthcare, saying that there are plenty of things that can be re-traumatizing. So do you ask? Sure, you ask. But you also are very much aware of the relational triggers, the gender of the healthcare practitioner. The power dynamics are extremely important, particularly for children. Even in a dentist's office, for instance, a child in a foster care situation who's been sexually abused is going to have a lot of trouble with lying on her back and allowing somebody to be in her mouth, with as the dentist or using the dental hygienist, or when you're doing even fluoride varnish application within the hospital or within the primary care facility. Next slide. And there are formal screening. This is available online, but the what we might once again, we're really talking about a public health stratification. We have a universal screening and then a targeted screening for certain populations, as you can read along the side there. And then for a minority of children who have persistent distress and require more support, those are the ones that you have to refer. So you screen children, screen parents and family members, screen healthcare providers. Next slide, please. Now, I'm going to reiterate that more often than not, you don't screen for trauma. You go upstream a little bit and you screen for food insecurity, you screen for housing insecurity, screen for transportation problems. Those are the factors that you can really do something about within a system. And in the hospital, you may want to know, for instance, do you need something at home? Do you need more information about what's going on with your child? But do you also need linking services so you have childcare at home so you can actually come see your child? Or do you have transportation problems? So parents, what do you need? It's my favorite question for foster parents, for instance. Parents, what do you need? Next slide. For screening healthcare workers, you might use the Professional Quality of Life Scale. It's a pretty good one. I have some difficulties with it. I don't like the term compassion satisfaction, but it does, because I think compassion is probably the answer. Empathy is a problem. Empathy is too sticky. But compassion is, it's a connection with a person's suffering, but also a commitment to make it better. But this is a good scale. It's just we're just arguing about words or jargon. Next slide, please. And then you respond by incorporating the knowledge of trauma into policies and procedures, and particularly resist re-traumatization. I've given you plenty of hints of things that might be re-triggering in kids within your system, and so I can't go through all of those examples again, but I'm certain that you can come to your own conclusion about what you need to do to resist re-traumatization. Next slide, please. Remembering that safety, trustworthiness, peer support, a culture of mutuality, that's a really huge one. How do we create a culture of mutuality?
And I have his shots record and everything.
Within a hospital system. And then we also consider the adolescent voice and the family voices within shared decision making, and also cultural, historical, and gender concerns. These are all from SAMHSA that you can find. These are just sort of the key principles. Next slide, please. To be more specific about organizational practices, providing resources on trauma, building on its strengths, collaborate across child-serving systems, and engaging families, extremely important, but also being aware of secondary traumatic stress by supporting staff and implementing culturally appropriate and evidence-based assessments. Next slide, please. Andy's going to talk about this, but I want to highlight the benefits of Reach Out and Read. Promotion of early childhood literacy is a tremendous platform to promote relational health between parents and children. You engage serve and return, meaning it's the typical serve and return is the peekaboo game with a 12-month-old, but you can see even further plenty of applications at each level. So you promote caretaker resilience, the typical story about putting the oxygen mask on yourself before you put it on your child when you're on an airplane. Promote caretaker resilience is part of promotion for relational health and resilience for children. Next slide, please. And that's that's the paradigm of the 2-generation interventions. The 2-gen interventions or multi-gen interventions are strongest, particularly with home visitings. I noticed there was a community health worker on the in the group today, and I'm very much an advocate for CHWs, in particular being aware of the trauma to the CHWs, but also to give CHWs tools and strategies to help families with trauma and to identify families that need more interventions. Next slide, please. We talk a lot about keeping the environment in the hospital safe physically, but we also need to keep it safe emotionally, and making sure that staff are trained and maintain healthy interpersonal boundaries. We're also being aware of how cultural backgrounds affect the perception of trauma and safety and privacy. Next slide. And this is just this is the border wall in McAllen, and it's a reminder that sufrimiento no tiene fronteras. Suffering has no borders. And the children that are coming from Afghanistan, the children are now coming from Ukraine, the children coming from Central America, all are children that have been exposed to potentially traumatic events, and these are children that need specific intervention. Next slide, please. Cultural humility and responsiveness is important. Now, I put this slide mostly to show you that if you want to read something that'll help you along the way with your own thinking, The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down by Anne Fadiman is really a great read. William Osler, our long-term mentor, says that the good physician treats the disease and the great physician treats the patient who has the disease. I think it's a really important statement. I'll highlight also that we watch for miscommunication. Instead of having translators for people that don't speak English, for instance, it's not enough to have a translator. It's not even enough to have an interpreter. It's more important to have a cultural interpreter. How we understand, to have the interpreter help us understand how what we're doing to kids, or how we engage with children and families, how they're receiving that, how they're understanding that within the context of their own traditions. Next slide, please. Trauma-informed pediatric ethics. As you see, this once again is a process or framework, a way of doing ethics. But I want to highlight the fact that the ethics consultations and ethics considerations, looking at ethical dilemmas within the healthcare system, and they're ubiquitous. They're in primary care. They're also within ICUs, from top to bottom. The first thing to do, I think, in these days, is to be aware of power differentials. That's the ethical dilemma are contextual and intersectional, meaning they come from all different directions. And our awareness is that it's holistic, that we're thinking about the whole child and the whole family. Next slide, please. And here are some ways that we might buffer secondary traumatic stress. Particularly, we need to raise awareness of secondary traumatic stress. I'm a great supporter of reflective supervision. That's a strategy that is common within relationship-based organizations and allows people to talk, allows people the opportunity. They don't have to do it, but it allows them the opportunity to talk about their own trauma and how that relates to how they're responding to their work situation. And within a hospital situation, or even within a child serving system anywhere, child protection or anywhere, to use behavioral interviewing during hiring to screen for empathy and non-judgment and collaboration. These are virtues or skills that we'd like to see in people when they come to work with us. Next slide. Some questions that we might ask for organizational readiness. I think for time purpose, we'll just move along. Next slide, please. Now, hospitals can be anchor institutions. and I'll emphasize the community collaboration. Absolutely, this is intersectional, but it's also interagency, interdisciplinary, and community collaboration is extremely important. And hospitals such as Nationwide, for instance, in Columbus, have done some, and Cincinnati, and I think in Cleveland, and Andy will talk about this, about how we might help promote trauma-informed care within first responders, teachers, and juvenile justice. Next slide. This is the summary. The origins of lifelong health are in early childhood. Exposure is ubiquitous. My own formulation, toxic stress, is primarily physiologic and trauma is holistic. Relational health buffers early childhood adversity. TIC builds on strengths and families, and the key concepts include family engagement, mutuality, cultural humility, and commitment to both physical and emotional safety. Next slide, please. And we'll end with this, the two sources that I'll give, and then it's a handoff to Andy. The first source is Heather Forkey, my co-author with the statements from the Academy. I wrote a book called Childhood Trauma and Resilience. I recommend it highly. And then Andy, you wrote the Thinking Developmentally, Nurturing Wellness in Childhood to Promote Lifelong Health. Excellent book, both excellent books, and I give you more specific information about how to identify children who are at risk for long-term effects of early childhood adversity. And then I'm going to pass it along to Andy. Thank you for your attention. I appreciate the opportunity here today. And Andy, you can take it from here.
Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Duffy, for the plug for the book, as well as it's always a pleasure to share time with you. I always learn so much from listening to you. Whoops, I don't know how I got to that slide. Let's go out of here. Sorry, guys. There we go. Let's go to the very beginning here. Beginning. Perfect. So to introduce myself, I am a primary care pediatrician. I've been one for almost 22 years now. I also have a background in developmental neuroscience, and I had the honor of being the co-author on the recent AAP policy statement on childhood toxic stress. And in that policy statement, we have tried to begin pivoting from sort of deficit-based models towards strengths-based models. And so I'm going to sort of build on a lot of the themes that Dr. Duffy introduced there. I will also start a little bit with some science, just because I think that developmental science really can sort of ground our thinking about this, allowing us to sort of peer inside that sort of proverbial black box and let us understand how experiences, both positive and nurturing as opposed to adverse, are sort of biologically embedded and impact life course trajectories. But the thing that's really striking to me is that there's this emerging science that's showing that, it's really not enough to just prevent the bad stuff, right? I mean, we want to prevent ACEs, we want to prevent trauma, we want to prevent toxic stress responses, but that's actually not enough. If we want kids to thrive and flourish and fulfill their potential, we have to sort of bake in some good stuff. And that comes as no surprise to anyone that's interested in prevention or public health, right? That universal primary preventions have always been sort of the base of that public health pyramid. And so that's why the title of my talk is, beyond toxic stress. We have to go beyond these toxic stress responses and the deficit-based models to begin trying to build some strengths-based models. And how do we do that then in primary care? In terms of disclosures, you've already heard I did co-author a book that I get some nominal royalties from the AAP, but other than that, I don't have any other financial conflicts of interest. So
Dr.
learning,
Gardner,
yeah.
Can you share your slides with us?
Oh, I thought I was. Oh no, that's no good. So sorry, guys.
It's okay. I just didn't want to interrupt you.
No. I thought I was. Let's go back here. You hate when that happens. Hold on here. I thought I did. So let's go back here. I'm so glad you interrupted me here. That would have been a problem.
There we go.
All right. Very
Perfect.
good. Thank you for the interruption here. Let's go back in the current slide here. There we go. All right. Very good. So in terms of learning objectives, I'm going to define toxic stress and how it really sort of helps us understand the problem. And then we're going to talk about relational health and how it helps to elucidate the solution. Then we're going to describe 3 different lenses that inform our efforts to sort of operationalize relational health. And so in a sense, we're going to talk about beyond toxic stress, the what, the why, and the how. So this is the proverbial black box I was talking about, whether or not you're looking at retrospective epidemiologic studies or prospective interventional studies. There's the same sort of time frame. There's a childhood experience, either nurturing or adverse. There's the proverbial black box, and then there are adult outcomes. And of course, the ACE study is the one we think about most in terms of the adverse side of things. But we have to make sure we're not thinking about just the traditional ACEs. As Dr. Duffy put it out, there are other ACEs as well: exposure to poverty and racism and social isolation. Those are all associated with poor health, academic failure, and economic hardship. But the good news is early childhood experiences cut both ways, right? There are also nurturing experiences. So we know positive childhood experiences, and we'll talk a little bit about those in a little bit, just having opportunities to be with attuned adults, developmentally appropriate play, and reach out and read, something Dr. Duffy mentioned before. Those are all associated with healthy lifestyles, academic success, and economic stability. And so they're really not the $1 million, not the $1 billion, really the $1 trillion question is, what's going on inside the box here? What's the biology that's underlying these strong associations? And let's be clear, they're associations. It's not destiny, right? So if you've experienced adversity, you're not doomed to failure. And if you have every material advantage, you're not guaranteed success. And so we know that from experiences that some kids will have every possible advantage, yet they do poorly. And we say, well, they're sort of doomed, or they were difficult, or they had a difficult temperament. And then other kids have tremendous adversity, yet they do well. And we say, oh, well, geez, those people, they're pretty resilient, right? So the point is, if we can understand the biology that's going on inside this box, we're in a better position to not only prevent the bad outcomes, but also to promote the positive outcomes. So how do we begin dividing, or sort of defining and measuring adversity? And that's where it gets a little tricky, because we all know that adversity and stress is pretty subjective, right? I mean, so one man's overwhelming challenges, another man's really exciting challenge or opportunity. Excuse me. And one child may hear a dog barking and think, oh, puppy, let's play, and another is terrified, right? And some of that has to do with what Dr. Duffy was referring to, that trauma also is relative to our previous experiences and how we interpret events. And that also is mediated by the way the people around us teach us the meaning behind those events. But the point is, Dr. Shonkoff many years ago came up with this taxonomy of stress, right? And so there are positive stress responses that are brief and mild to moderate intensity. They're what most kids experience as they grow up. And in the presence of safe, stable, nurturing relationships, that stress response returns to baseline pretty quickly. So the point is that positive stress experiences can actually build motivation, confidence, and resilience for the future. Positive stress is not the absence of stress. And that's important, because we're not trying to put kids in a bubble. We're not trying to make sure that nothing ever adverse ever happens to them. Just think about this whole pandemic, right? I mean, it's sort of untenable to propose we're going to prevent any adversity. And the truth is, we don't really want that. We want kids to learn the skills to deal with adversity. So it's not that we want no distress, we want them to learn distress tolerance and how to build those skills. So on the other end of the spectrum, though, as Dr. Duffy mentioned, there is toxic stress, right? So toxic stress responses are longer lasting, more frequent, or stronger in intensity. We can see how the traditional ACEs might precipitate those sort of physiological responses, because there's insufficient social emotional buffering. There's not enough of those safe, stable, nurturing relationships to really turn off that stress response. And as a consequence, we're sort of bathed in those physiologic mediators of stress. And those in turn then can cause potentially permanent changes and long-term effects. And we know that those experiences can literally change who we are at the molecular, cellular, and behavioral levels. And so if you're thinking about at the molecular level, what we're really talking about is epigenetics, right? And that's part of a much larger sort of evolution that's happening in genomics right now, where we used to think that the genes you inherited were sort of destiny. But in reality, the genome is actually relatively plastic. It's sensitive to environmental input. And so it can change, which is good news, because if you inherit a gene, it makes it very likely you're going to be an alcoholic. But the environment ever turns that gene on, then it may not be as big a risk factor. So epigenetics can, and in terms of the as an example of how adversity can change at the molecular level. At the cellular level, we know that brain development is very experience dependent, right? And how the brain connects and wires itself, and then even rewires in response to experience, which is plasticity. So those are good examples of how adversity can sort of change who we are at the cellular level. At the behavioral level, there's this term called allostasis, and I want to unpack just a little bit. Dr. Duffy mentioned homeostasis, which is the body's desire to remain at a certain level. And so when the environment pushes us, allostasis is the active response to get back to normal. And so we're talking about stress, we're talking about things that sort of turn off the stress response. And so behavioral allostasis, these are behaviors we may do to try and turn off the stress response. And they may be very adaptive initially. So eating, smoking, promiscuity, those are things that will turn off stress in the short term, but they can certainly cause bigger issues down the line. But the kicker here is all this science that's led up to us to understanding toxic stress and how experiences become biologically embedded. The kicker is that same biology underlies how relational health becomes embedded, right? And so relational health and toxic stress are really sort of two sides of the same coin. So again, I mentioned if you have a significant adversity, that can increase the methylation patterns of the glucocorticoid receptor. So we have changes at the molecular level in DNA methylation patterns. Adversity can change EEG patterns, right? And it also can lead to behavioral allostasis. But we're learning more and more that relational health, particularly in the form of breastfeeding and just tender touch, that can decrease those same glucocorticoid methylation patterns. And if you're looking at EEG patterns and evidence-based intervention like attachment and biobehavioral catch-up, that can actually normalize those EEG patterns that were abnormal due to adversity. And we know that relational health in the form of safe, stable, nurturing relationships that buffers adversity and it promotes the skills needed for resilience. So if toxic stress is the problem, relational health is the solution. So let's just define a little bit more about what we mean when we say relational health. Relational health refers to the ability to develop and sustain safe, stable, and nurturing relationships. And these in turn provide kids with those positive childhood experiences. So relational health can happen at many different levels. It can happen at the dyadic level, which is what we tend to think of as pediatricians, parent and caregiver and their interactions. But it also happens at the familial level in terms of interfamilial interactions. And it also happens at the community level in terms of what we consider to be normative behaviors and how we agree to interact at a societal level. A good example of this, I think, is shared reading. Dr. Duffy mentioned reach out and read. Shared reading is something that happens at dyadic level. It can be fostered in the families, and it can be something that can be celebrated at the community level. Relational health also refers to how we as professionals interact with families, and also how medical homes and staff interact with other community partners. So the take home though is that, relational health, it buffers adversity. It's sort of built in to the definition of toxic stress, right? Toxic stress happens in the absence of those buffers, but it also builds the skills needed to be resilient in the future. And that was sort of one of the take home messages from the AAP policy statement. So the first assertion here that it buffers adversity, it's sort of baked into the definition of toxic stress. But in terms of building the skills needed for resilience, I just want to show one quick study for you that came out in the last 2 years. I think is really, at least for me, was a light bulb moment. So this came from Christina Bethel's work. It was published in Health Affairs, and they did a large nationwide study of children's health. They looked at over 51,000 parents, and they defined a child flourishing index. And this child flourishing index is really a measure of executive function, right? It's sort of what we all want for our kids. And they measured it from a scale of 0 to 3. And the parents had to say it was definitely true that their child was curious, completes things, and was in control. So that's a pretty high bar. I mean, I'm not trying to meet that criteria myself most days. But the point is that they defined this child flourishing index. And then they also looked at whether there was family resilience and connection. And that ranged from 0 to 6. And they asked, when your family faces a problem, How often are you likely to talk about it together, work together, remember you have strengths, stay positive? And then they ask their parents, can they share ideas or talk about things that matter, and how well they're sort of handling the day-to-day demands of raising a family. So again, I mentioned before that this measure of flourishing, the Child Flourishing Index, it's a pretty high bar, and they saw nationally about 40% of kids are flourishing. And then not surprisingly, if you looked at how that matched up with family resilience and connection, when children had more family resilience and connection, more of those kids were flourishing by that definition. But for me, this was the kicker. This was a really light bulb moment. They also broke it up by ACEs, right? And so if you look at kids that have high numbers of ACEs, 4 to 9 level ACEs, so a high level of adversity, but they also had high resilience and connection, more of those kids were flourishing than kids that had 0 ACEs, no adversity, but also didn't have the family resilience and connection, right? So if we're just looking at diversity, if we're just looking at toxic stress and trauma and all the bad stuff, we're really sort of missing the point. All kids, and particularly those that experience adversity, need relational health to flourish. So I'm not really good at math, but to try and model this, I think it's important because we tend to think about adversity and nurturing experiences as being 2 ends of one spectrum, just one axis of childhood experiences. But the reality is they're actually 2 completely separate axes that interact to determine how well kids do. So the first axis are the more ACEs, obviously that's on the negative side, and then fewer ACEs, that's on the positive side. But then there's the positive dimension too. You know, do you have few positive child experiences, or do you have lots of positive child experiences? And they both then in turn map onto whether or not a child's going to do well or not. And so just as an example, if we just consider a child who has an ACE score, and then say it's a relatively high ACE score, and we map that out, we say, well, yeah, that kid's probably not going to fare very well. If we factor in that they have few positive child experiences, we might predict it would fare even worse. But the kicker from Christina Bethel's data shows that kids that have ACEs but do have positive child experiences, they may actually fare relatively well, right? And so this is important. High adversity does not mean you're doomed or broken, right? But the converse is also true, right? If you have low adversity, you're not necessarily in the clear, right? So if you have a low ACE score, you know, I predict that kid may do pretty well. And if we factor in that they have lots of positive experiences, we may predict that they would do even better. But if we factor in the fact they have few positive experiences, they may actually fare relatively poorly. And that's what Christina Bethel's data points out. And so kids with low adversity, but low relational health may actually fare relatively poorly. The point here is that preventing ACEs is not enough, right? All kids, especially those with ACEs, need those positive childhood experiences that come from safe, stable, nurturing relationships, that come from relational health. And it reminds us that adversity and positive experiences, they coexist in the lives of children every day. So going back to that first question about, you know, what's going on inside the box, we've got toxic stress leading to epigenetic changes and changes in brain connectivity and behavioral allostasis leading to poor outcomes. But on the positive side of things, we have those safe, stable, and nurturing relationships that leads to social emotional learning and healthy adaptations. And so Christina Bethel's data, though, tells us that, you know, just preventing adversity is not enough. It's not. We also need to actively promote relational health if we want to promote positive outcomes. So then the question is, you know, not to steal a line from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, but how do we go about literally building a culture of relational health? Not just a culture of health, a culture of relational health. To that, I would say, you know, there's this quote from Buckminster Fuller who said, "You never change things by fighting the existing reality." And I love that picture of someone slamming their head against the desk. I think a lot of us in childhood services feel like that a lot of times because we're fighting against the existing reality. To change something, you need to build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. And so this is where the AP policy statement was trying to go, that we want to pivot from deficit-based models. And I put the little symbol for medicine there just to remind us that, you know, if you think about it, medicine is a deficit-based model. We literally get paid on the basis of what is wrong with you and what we did to you, a diagnosis code and a procedural code, right? And that really is not conducive to what pediatricians and community health workers and prevention is all about. So we need to pivot from deficits-based models to strengths-based models, relationships. So how do we do that? I would submit that there's sort of 3 lenses we need to use to sort of operationalize relational health. It needs to be 2 generational, it needs to be developmental, and it needs to be a public health approach. And I'll go through each of these. But the 2-generational approach, Dr. Duffy already mentioned, it's really partnering with caregivers in order to help their children. The developmental approach, it's a little more sophisticated and complicated, but I think it's really insightful. So I'm going to spend a lot of time on that, and really gets down to the fact that affect regulation and relational health are moving targets. So our interventions need to move as well. And then finally, public health approach is what a lot of you on the call are probably most familiar with. Dr. Duffy mentioned it before, and it was really the focus, one of the main take-home points from the AAP policy statement, and we'll talk about that at the end then. So in terms of a 2-generational approach, I love this quote from Uri Bronfenbrenner, who was one of the co-founders of Head Start. He says, in order to develop normally, a child requires progressively more complex joint activity with one or more adults who have an irrational emotional relationship with the child. Someone's got to be crazy about that kid. That's number one, first, last, and always. I can't think of a better way of sort of summarizing, the fact that we got to get caregivers in sort of relational mode, out of survival mode and in relational mode. And so it has to be a 2-generational approach. And so how do we do that? How do we get caregivers out of relational mode and into out of survival mode rather, and into relational mode? I think it starts by meeting their needs, right? That's why Dr. Duffy was saying, we need to think about screening for things like food insecurity and poverty and housing insecurity, because if the parental needs aren't met, they're going to be in survival mode. The kids are going to be in survival mode. But if we have the parents out in relational mode, we've met their most basic needs. I think there is a biological drive there to connect with their kids. And then if we can help develop those safe, stable, nurturing relationships, now we have a child who's in relational mode. If the child's in relational mode, now we're in a position where we can actually use developmentally appropriate play and things like reach out and read to scaffold new skills, to really nurture growth and learning. And this is no surprise. We've always known that what kids need is to feel connected, and they need scaffolding, they need structure in order to do well. So if we have the scaffolding of new skills, hopefully we're focusing on those foundational social, emotional, language skills that allow that child to remain in relational mode and to promote the attachment with the caregiver. And so now we don't have a vicious cycle of toxic stress. We have an auspicious cycle of relational health, that the caregiver's in relational mode, the child's in relational mode, and we're scaffolding new skills. But we know the thing that's going to break that cycle, unmet needs for the caregiver, right? So just to give an example, that really I think it's a visceral way of seeing this sort of 2-generational give and take. I'm going to try, if everything goes well with the electronics here, to have you visit and watch this tronic still face experiment. You may have seen this before, but it really talks about this. It really shows in a very visceral way the 2-generational give and take. And what you're going to see is synchrony at first when they're playing back and forth. Then you're going to see a mismatch, which sort of mimics what happens every day. I mean, we can't always be in tune with our kids. We have to attend to life now and then. And so this is where they ask mom to have a still face and not be responsive. But you'll see how quickly that is distressing to the child. But in my mind, the take home here is the repair. And it's very short at the end, but very quickly the child will calm when mom re-engages, right? And so we're learning more about what's called biobehavioral synchrony, which is when you have these magical moments of being attuned, that can actually turn off the child's stress response. It's also known as autonomic emotional connection, so that our autonomic nervous systems really are connected. And it's also, Tronic likes to call it interactive repair. So hopefully we can get this to work, and we'll see, and I'll come back to this then. Let's see if it works here.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to
Can you hear that?
the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started.
It's very low.
Oh, bummer.
When people didn't think that it couldn't.
Do you want me to share my screen, Dr. Gardner?
Yeah, why don't you try doing that? I think it's important you hear. I mean, I guess you don't necessarily need to hear it, all of the commentary, but why don't you go ahead and try running it from your screen and see if people can hear it better.
Babies young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby, who's about a year of age.
I'm my girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this. And then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it. They actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a big girl.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
You can share your
Awesome.
screen again, Dr. Gardner.
Okay, perfect. I'm glad we were prepared for that. Sorry that it didn't come through loudly on my computer there, but I hope you got that sense. I mean, I think that you can see visually, you know, when they're going back and forth there is that sort of being in sync, right? That there is this sort of biobehavioral synchrony that's going on. And we can also see that there's going to be mismatch. I mean, mismatch happens, right? I mean, that's why the American Academy of Pediatrics for a long time has said that kids benefit from having two adults. It does not matter the gender or sexual orientation of those adults, but if there are two adults in the home, because you can't always be attuned with someone all the time, but if you have two, at some point you're going to be in tune with this one, in tune with that one. Really, really important. And but in my mind, and I think Dr. Tronick as well, his most recent research is really looking at the repair, how long it takes to repair, how long it takes to get back in sync again. And you can see how, you know, parents that might be overwhelmed due to their own situation, their own social determinants of health, their own mental health issues, it's going to be a lot harder for them to have that repair. And that's going to lead to consequences down the line. So it sounds like I'm saying the solution is easy, right? All we need to do is teach parents and caregivers how to repair, how to engage, how to attune. Obviously, it's not that easy, right? And that's what the next slide talks about, is that parenting and parenting interventions, it's really very complicated. So we've got a child, we've got a parent, and we've got, here it's a primary care pediatrician, but it could easily be a community health worker or a teacher. And the child has a behavior, and we tend to label that as being good or bad or helpful or hurtful or age appropriate or not. But I think it's really more probably useful to think about, is it adaptive or maladaptive? And that's really dependent on the context. And then we have the parent, who has their own set of behaviors, trying to impact the child and the child's behaviors. And so we define different parenting styles. We say, is it positive parenting style, which has many different definitions? Is it responsive in terms of serve and return? And I would say, is it really promoting a safe, stable, nurturing relationship? And then you have the professional, right? And we have our own set of behaviors that we're trying to influence the parent, because we only see the parent and the child for a certain amount of time. We want the parent's behavior long-term to influence the child. And then we have the same sort of styles that you might attribute to parents. We can be authoritarian, right? You got to do it this way. We can be sort of permissive or indifferent. We can be authoritative. And I would say, are we promoting a caring therapeutic relationship with that caregiver? And then we have to acknowledge the behaviors go the other way as well. The child's behavior can impact the parent. So we have mismatches in temperament, and the parent's behavior may cause secondary trauma to us, and it may trigger unconscious bias. And so it's really very complicated. But our hope is that our therapeutic relationship, there's this idea of parallel processing, that our therapeutic relationship with the caregiver is going to in turn translate in the way the caregiver interacts with the child, and we're going to promote those adaptive responses. And so through trusted and respectful relationships with parents and caregivers, we work to improve relational health in order to improve the health and development of our patients. So that's all I'm going to say about the 2 generational bullets. But I will add one more thing. Dr. Duffy mentioned the good Dr. Bowlby. There's a great quote by Dr. Bowlby that was published by the World Health Organization in 1952. So that's 70 years ago. And he said, communities that value children must cherish their parents. I just think it really sort of summarizes exactly what we're saying in terms of a 2-generational approach. All right, so moving on to the second lens then, and this gets a little more complicated, is we also need to have a developmental approach, right? So those safe, stable, and nurturing relationships, that's a skill, right? And relational health is a capacity, and there are prerequisite social, emotional, language, and cognitive skills to have that relational health. And these foundational skills can be modeled, taught, and practiced. So Dr. Duffy mentioned there may be some intrinsic things that you're born with. That's true. That's like saying it may be a little easier or harder for certain kids to learn math. But if you have trouble with math, we don't say sucks to be you. We work with you to build those skills. And it's the same sort of thing. We can work with families and children to build these relational health skills. So the point is that relational health can be learned, right? And then the question then is, well, how do children, and I would say adults as well, learn these capacities? So there, I think it's really useful to know the work about Bruce Perry. So if you know Bruce Perry, he just recently wrote a book with Oprah Winfrey. He's a big proponent of what he calls neurosequential model. And there is some basis in the way the brain works. And he says you need to regulate first, then relate, and then reason. And so when he says reason, he's really referring to the thinking and learning brain, right? The ability to build new skills. And obviously our attempts to build new skills with children need to be developmentally appropriate. And that's where a lot of Brazelton's work and touch points comes in. It's noting new milestones as they emerge and using them to get to the next level. It's almost the Vygotsky model of development. In that narrow range zone of proximal development, we can have the interaction to help them learn new skills. And reason accounts for the fact that there are foundational skills that we need to have that are necessary for more advanced skills like self-control and resilience. But before we can reason, we got to upstream and have relate, right? So relate refers to that connection that occurs, that biobehavioral synchrony that you see in that Tronic still space video. It's also known as autonomic emotional connection. And during that, the responsive attuned caregivers can turn off the amygdala, which is the off switch for the stress response. And they also turn on the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus, that thinking learning brain we're talking about. And so in today's lingo, it's really as if, those caregivers can sort of hack in remotely and turn off the stress response, right? We've got a biological code that we can connect emotionally with other people, and that will turn off the stress response. And so we need to have that relating to turn off the stress response so that we're actually able to reason better. But then how are we going to have the relating unless there's someone around who's actually regulated, right? And that refers to having affect regulation and feeling safe. And so it's the ability to understand and handle strong emotions in a healthy, adaptive manner. And again, it's a prerequisite for relating and connecting with others emotionally, and then reasoning and learning. So again, I mentioned before, there is a parallel process here. If the pediatric provider regulates, relates, and then reasons with the parent or caregiver, then the parent or caregiver is more likely to regulate, relate, and then reason with the child. So it all starts with this idea in my mind of affect regulation, right? I mean, because if the caregiver is not regulated, then it's going to be hard to relate. It's going to be hard to reason. It's going to be hard to build skills. But the problem is affect regulation is really a complicated thing. There are 3 different structures we want to talk about, and then we want to think about developmentally over time. So the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, they're sort of the off switches for the stress response, right? They're important for executive function, which is sort of the air traffic controller for the brain, and short-term memory. And so they allow for conscious, intentional, and adaptive responses to threats and strong emotions, and they have the capacity to shut down the amygdala, right? So this is where self-regulation comes from, and it matures later in development. The amygdala is the on switch for the stress response, and that allows for reflexive, impulsive, emotional responses that are often aggressive, and it matures early in development, which makes sense evolutionarily. When you're young, you want to shoot first and ask questions later, or there may not be tomorrow, right? But it in turn then shuts down the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus, right? So it literally prevents the ability to think adaptively and learn new skills. So we got to turn off that amygdala. So young children need those safe, stable, and nurturing relationships to turn off the amygdala for them. So we're going to have a caregiver regulate and relate and turn off the stress response that happens through this biobehavioral synchrony. Again, it's another way to think about it is that emotions are contagious, right? So if we have caregivers that are activated, the children are going to be activated. If we have parents that are regulated, we're going to have kids that are going to be more likely to be regulated. That in turn releases the brakes on the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus and allow children to be creative, to be social, and to learn. Again, it's all in the context of relationships, though. So older children, we'll get to in just a second, they also need those safe, stable, nurturing relationships to promote formalized social emotional learning. But I first want to talk a little bit about how this happens developmentally. So let's think about this. So, when you're an infant, the attuned parents and caregivers, they are the locus of affect regulation for the child, right? When they're calm, nurturing, consistently available, they act as almost an emotional container, which is something that Heather Forkey talks about in her book. But it can be hard for parents to give something they never had, and we have to acknowledge that the parents have their own needs, right? And so we need to help the parents in order to help the caregivers. Then as we get older, beginning in infancy, and particularly through the toddler years, but also ongoing, it's about the dance, the dyadic dance, right? The locus is actually in the dance. It's in that biobehavioral feedback, the biobehavioral synchrony that's happening. That dance is the regulation for the child, like we saw in the Tronic experiment. And there we need to use development appropriate play and Brazelton's approach to support the dance. So initially we got to support the parents and ongoing, and then we got to support the dance and ongoing. And then beginning in preschool, but always room for improvement, we want the child to have affect regulation, right? The child becomes the locus, right? And so self-regulation is the objective. And self-regulation begins to develop as a child learns adaptive ways to cope with strong emotions, not to say that strong emotions are wrong. They're not allowed to feel that way, which is what we tend to do as a society. We want to normalize those emotions, but then give them the skills to cope in a healthy manner. And that's where formalized social emotional learning comes in place. So let's talk just briefly about social emotional learning. This is really for the older kids, but also for adults, right? It refers to self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and decision-making. And the point is that these are all skills that can be learned. It may be easier or harder for one child versus another, but we can still model, teach, practice, and reinforce by celebrating these skills when we see them. And that's the thing that I find so frustrating. Where do we see as a society that we're celebrating these skills? Right? I mean, unless you're watching Mr. Rogers or Ted Lasso, you're not seeing kindness being celebrated. So the bottom line is that it really begins again with this self-awareness and strong emotions are a normal part of being human. They're okay. The challenge is to be aware, normalize, and learn healthy adaptations. We actually want to sort of build again sort of distress tolerance in a developmental model. And so, the way I think about it is, strong emotions, they demand distraction, at least initially. And they're unhealthy distractions, and those are the behavioral allostasis we talked about at the beginning. These are ways of turning off stress that in the short term are distractions, and they're healthy in the sense they turn off the stress response, but in the long run, they cause many more problems. And then there are sort of escapes, I sort of think of as waste of time. These are sort of passive entertainment, right? They're not really bad for you unless you're not moving all the time, but they're not really building generalizable skills. But then we have healthy distractions, play, art, sports, music, those passions. And then we say, oh, well, those kids are resilient, but are we giving families and children the opportunity to build those skills? The point is that shared reading is a good example again. And those safe, stable, and nurturing relationships help kids to channel that emotional energy into something constructive. There's nothing wrong with those strong emotions. There's nothing wrong with feeling that way. It's knowing what to do about it. All right, so that's the second lens, and I know I'm running out of time here, but I'm going to quickly go to the third lens, which is the public health approach, which hopefully will be, something that this group understands already, being a prevention and public health group. But so relational health is a paradigm shift, right? And it has potential transformational implications for how we train clinicians, how we fund practice, how we research and advocacy and policy, but also in terms of practice. And so I'm going to talk just a little bit about how we operationalize relational health. It's going to require sort of layered efforts, which in the public health model, of course, is vertical integration, but then it also needs to be across sectors, right? And so that's all sectors that interact with children and families. That's sort of called horizontal integration. So what would an integrated public health approach look like that not only prevents toxic stress, but also promotes relational health? So just to briefly review what the public health pyramid looks like, we have sort of primary, secondary, and tertiary preventions, which I sort of think of as be well, stay well, and get well. And just using the analogy to lead poisoning, universal primary preventions are for everyone. They're trying to promote wellness and prevent disease. An example there is we remove lead from products like gasoline and paint. Secondary target interventions for those that are higher risk. And so we're going to screen for lead based on your risks and abate if we find it. So that's on the basis of a zip code and how old your house is. And then there's tertiary prevention. Those are indicated treatments, right? To treat disease. An example there would be chelation therapy. But the point is, all these are necessary. You sometimes have people saying, well, this is more important than that. They're all necessary. No one would argue that we just need to treat lead poisoning by chelation therapy. And no one's going to say that we're not going to screen for kids that need treatment. So all are necessary, none are sufficient. So let's apply this then to toxic stress, right? So to be well, we want to have universal preventions for all kids and families. We want positive parenting styles, again, acknowledging that supporting parents it has to be nothing about them without them, and defining what their goals are for parenting, but acknowledging that developmentally appropriate play is integral, as is reach out and read, and consistent messaging about what the basic biological needs of kids are. They need to feel safe, stable, and secure. The secondary would be targeted interventions, and this is where we're screening, right? We're going to screen basis on parent or child adversity. We may screen on the basis of social determinants of health. And as science marches forward, we may begin screening for biomarkers. Jack, Sean, cough, and many people are looking for a cheek swab that'll measure interleukins and methylation patterns and give you a marker as to how high risk you are for long-term consequences of adversity. And then tertiary interventions, Dr. Duffy mentioned these briefly: attachment and biobehavioral catch-up, parent-child interaction therapy, child-parent psychotherapy. These are all indicated treatments for toxic stress. So if you look at these sort of interventions, though, you could also say, geez, in addition to preventing toxic stress, we're actually promoting relational health, right? So all these, universal preventions, what are they doing? They're promoting safe, stable, nurturing relationships in a two-generational manner. They're building two-generational relational skills. And then the screening, what we're really doing is we're identifying potential barriers to safe, stable, nurturing relationships. And if we're looking at those interventions, tertiary interventions, they're really trying to repair strained or compromised relationships. The point here is that a public health approach to prevent toxic stress is a public health approach to promote relational health, right? And no one's going to say that one's more important than the other. They're all necessary. So why isn't this working? Because the minute the pyramid's upside down, right? And we all know this, right? So although there are evidence-based interventions to repair relational health, they're expensive, they're labor and time intensive, and they're hard to access because they're limited providers, and demand already outstrips supply, and it's not getting better. Secondary screens, there is a growing movement to identify potential barriers to relational health, but the systems aren't incentivized to do so, and there are not enough community resources available to address these barriers in many circumstances. And then finally, supporting families and their communities is the foundation of that public health approach, but it's not a priority for our society, right? And it runs counter to the current financial incentives in healthcare, which prioritize procedures over relationships and quantity over quality. So I realize I'm quickly running out of time here, so I'm just going to go briefly through this public health approach to build relational health. If we're talking about universal primary preventions, right, we want to support the development of safe, stable, nurturing relationships by loving the child, if not the behavior, understanding child development and what specific behaviors mean, having appropriate expectations, promoting positive but authoritative but not authoritarian parenting styles, and engaging in large amounts of developmentally appropriate play. We want to proactively build those foundational skills for resilience through those safe, stable, and nurturing relationships that model social capacities, emotional regulation. Again, there's this 2-generational and parallel process that's going on. We want to nurture foundational skills as they emerge using the touch points in Brazelton's approach. We want to help children as they get older know their passions, know their healthy distractions, acknowledge that it's okay to feel things strongly, but I'm going to feel better when I do this. Now we're actually teaching kids to cope instead of just saying stop. And we want to provide opportunities to practice and implement these foundational skills through everyday examples. I think sibling rivalry is a great opportunity to help them understand emotional regulation. And then when adversity does occur, we want to buffer it through safe, stable, nurturing relationships that reinforce that the child's safe, that routines are predictable, that it's stable, and that we have opportunities to use those healthy distractions, and that's the nurturing. So safe, stable, and nurturing. So that's the foundation of what we really wanted to talk about today. Just to finish the public health pyramid, yes, we do want to identify potential barriers. So, but we have to remember with that population, we still need to do the foundational. So we're still doing universal preventions we just talked about, but then we're layering on screening for common potential barriers, right? Begin universal screening for the most common things, and then begin to add on as you get additional supports. You want to obviously engage community partnerships to address those barriers, and start small, right? I mean, you can't screen for everything. There is no omniscreen, right? And so start with a low hanging fruit. And then, like Dr. Duffy mentioned, the real focus was not on treating kids that have experienced toxic stress and trauma here, but I would strongly urge you to look at Heather Forkey's book, and to remember for those kids, yes, we need to have treatments I'm going to talk about in a second, but we still need to target other potential barriers. So if we're doing attachment and biobehavioral catch-up, but we're not addressing the food insecurity and we're not having opportunities for play, we're not going to have an optimal outcome. So I think about, and as a primary care doc who's not going to be doing these tertiary interventions generally, I think about the common factors approach a lot: to form a therapeutic alliance, to demystify, and to provide hope. And these are acronyms that come from Heather Forkey's book. I'm not going to go through each of them now, but you can look them up as all those acronyms are opportunities to sort of do those common factors approach. And then we want to refer to evidence-based therapies if they're available, and if they're not, we want to advocate for them. Finally, that's sort of the vertical integration. We also have to acknowledge that there's also horizontal integration across services. And I know we're running out of time, but even though relational health is essentially dyadic, it's also influenced by the other spheres. So we want to focus again on the caregiver and the child. You know, do they both feel safe, connected, and supported? If they do, we're supporting relational health. If they don't, they're in survival mode, right? On the other hand, then what happens at the family level? If there's relational trauma due to intimate partner violence and substance abuse, that's going to hinder relational health of the dyad. But if there's family resiliency connection, like Dr. Bethel looked at, that's going to promote relational health. And then what happens at the neighborhood level? If there's unstable housing and neighborhood violence, that's going to hinder the relational health at the dyadic level. But if there's safe places to live and play and connect, that's going to promote. And then at the employment level, if there's discrimination on employment, that may hinder the relational health, but there are opportunities for growth and livable wages that may promote the dyad. And then even what happens at stranger level and what happens at our societal level, you know, if there are microaggressions and there's structural racism, that's going to hinder relational health. Well, on the other hand, if there's kindness and inclusion and diversity is valued, that's going to promote relational health. So horizontal integration is necessary across all family serving sectors. This is not just something that pediatricians are going to fix. This is something that really is a societal issue. But the good news is, if we get it right, if we get early relational health right, that's going to influence these other spheres as well as those children grow up. So moving beyond toxic stress, that was the title of my talk. You know, toxic stress defines the problem, right? And it helps explain how many of our most intractable problems are rooted in our shared biology, but divergent experiences and opportunities. Relational health, on the other hand, defines the solution, right? That explains how those individual, family, and community capacities that support the development and maintenance of those safe, stable, and nurturing relationships, they also buffer adversity and build resilience across the life course. So what does this mean for trauma-informed care? Just circling back to it, there are many definitions of trauma-informed care. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network says that agency providers need to address, parent and caregiver trauma and the impact on the family. Then we use culturally appropriate and evidence-based assessments and treatments. We want to make resources available on its impact and treatment. We want to routinely screen. We also want to strengthen resilience and protective factors. We want to increase the continuity of care and collaboration across systems. This is the horizontal integration. And we also want to minimize and treat secondary traumatic stress and increase staff resilience. So basically, these are all the elements I've talked about, right? This is 2-generational. This is tertiary prevention. This is secondary prevention. This is primary prevention. And this is horizontal integration across sectors. So the short of it is we have to partner with families and communities to promote safe, stable, nourishing relationships, address barriers, and repair strained relationships, and then use those relationships to not only buffer adversity, but also build resilience. So I'm just going to briefly paraphrase here from Frederick Douglass, but basically it's easier to help the caregivers as they build strong children than to repair broken men and women. And I'm sorry I went a little over time, but I'm happy to stay on a little longer or answer emails if there are other questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Gardner. Thank you, Dr. Duffy. It's a wonderful talk, and so glad that you're both able to speak today. I think the only question, and I think it kind of got answered, was do you think WIC should insist on some parenting classes on relational health? And someone had mentioned that the WIC department offers PPP, and so does Help Me Go programs, but it's not a requirement.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you get into mandates, it gets tricky. I mean, I'm a big fan of what's called self-determination theory. So self-determination theory holds that that there are external motivators, what I say, what you say, what society says, and then there are internal motivators, intrinsic motivators, and those are mainly much stronger, and they're motivated at the main things that drive intrinsic motivation are autonomy, which is why as soon as you make a suggestion, you've undercut it. Connection, which is why the relationships we have with parents and caregivers are so incredibly important. And then competence. And so I think that mandates get tricky. I think it has to be on the basis of the relationship that you have with the family and seeing the value of and reinforcing that they already know how they know those magical moments. They know when they're connecting with their kids. We want to celebrate those and reinforce those as being foundational. It's not just fun. That's simply a foundation for health. And so, yeah, I think it gets tricky when we have mandates. I think we want to try and, again, I think there is a biological drive for parents to connect with their kids. I think as a society, we put a lot of barriers in place of that. So we should probably address those barriers and then celebrate the connections as they happen. But I'd love to hear Dr. Duffy's response to that too.
I'm in agreement, and I put a response in the chat box about co-location or resources. I think it's really important for that sort of warm handoff. For instance, if a WIC would just walk down the hall and say, here's somebody come back, it's on better if you, rather than you say parenting classes, because that's pejorative. It's almost an insult to people. You know, I'm not a good parent. But if you say, well, most parents have difficulty with kids at bedtime. And we have some ways that we might be able to help with that. And so then you identify a particular problem and you can draw people in for a generalized intervention, not just about bedtime problems, but you can use that as a way to get in. My experience with mandates is that they're not extremely helpful. In fact, we can use big examples and small examples. Mandates for benefits, social benefits don't work. Work ban mandates for Medicaid, for instance, have never worked. But even on a smaller level, when we see kids and families that have been referred by juvenile corrections for parenting classes, it's usually very difficult to really get them engaged and get some benefit. But if you can identify a particular problem, let's deal with tantrums and when you go to the grocery store, or let's deal with difficulty with going to bed, or feeding problems, difficulty with resistance to foods and things like that. If you identify a particular problem and you can draw people in, and then it gets generalized and you develop those relationships that are really helpful. I'm going to go back to community health workers, for instance. We would like to see community health workers trained, for instance, in safe sleep and other easy community-based interventions that we can send CHWs out and actually see kids in their natural environment and help parents, support parents and what they would like to do. And I agree with Andy that we always want to make the assumption that people are doing the best they possibly can, and they all want to do the best they possibly can for their children. And that's the foundation that we build from.
Thank you both so much for answering that question. I think that provided a lot of great insight and a lot of good chat in the chat box. Well, thank you both so much for joining us on Friday and speaking. And thank you everyone for being here for the training. We are so glad that we're able to share this information with you all. And I will send a follow-up email on Monday with the survey to receive your CME credit and answer some questions about the training. And if you have any other questions for Dr. Gardner, Dr. Duffy, please feel free to email those to me and I will make sure that they get those and they can answer those for you all. And the slides and the PowerPoint will also be up on Monday. Anything else from Dr. Gardner, Dr. Duffy?
Nothing for me. It's always
I
great.
see lots of good comments in the chat box. So it's really grateful to you guys that you were engaged through the talk, and I look forward to having the conversation again at some point.
Yes, thank you all.
Sorry to talk over you, Andy. You talk.
Sorry, I'm sorry I talked so fast. I had too much I wanted to share, but it's always good to share the DS with you, Dr. Duffy.
It's great. Thank you both so much. Happy Friday and have a good weekend.
Thank you.